These results are from a PhD study that Kia generously helped fund some research activities and analysis on. I'm working with Dr. Liz Halpenny here at the University of Alberta on this as well, and need to acknowledge her advice and participation in this. I'm an environmental consultant by training, and I've gone back to school to research a group that I've worked with quite extensively, mainly because they've been able to successfully negotiate sustainable development through a collaborative process. And to me, that seemed really interesting. It's a rarity. In my world, quite often I'm dealing with this kind of conflict in a management context. The argument between sustainable development and sustainability, which Leanne really outlined very well. Quite often it ends up becoming a values discussion about appropriate resource use and resource conservation and the needs to conserve those things. And that dialogue obviously can become quite heated and conflictual as well. Collaboration's been proposed as a way of bridging that gap, bringing all the various stakeholders together, discuss issues, come up with site-specific appropriate means of dealing with the conflict over resource development and sustainable development as a whole. What does that look like for any given community? How do we go about achieving sustainable development on a landscape? It doesn't always work the way that we hope. And here's where I dive into the theory. We'll dive back out later and talk about how it applies in this particular circumstance. Actor network theory, or ANT, is a way of bringing environment into the discussion. In sociology, we tend to focus on human actors and what role they can play in facilitating conflict, coming up with normative systems. In ANT, the environment can actually play a role as well as an intermediary, or because this came from a French researcher, intéressement device that sort of drives the process through to an agreement process. So Callan theorized that there are 4 different stages for innovation or for collaboration as well. If you're proposing a new idea, usually you try to frame it as a problem and create some awareness and some support, hopefully, or recruitment of resources and people that are interested in your particular issue and solution. If you work that right, if there is enough interest, if there's enough support, enough agreement about your proposed solution, you can actually coordinate a group, come up with a plan, and then ultimately implement that. And in Callan's view of it, if you can work through this cycle, you can actually become normative. The innovation becomes accepted as mainstream and is adopted as a new practice. We know from looking at collaboration, sometimes you can have all the ingredients. You can have the right people, the right politicians, the right NGOs, all the interested stakeholders sitting at the table, and we're not able to come to consensus. We're not able to coordinate and pull off a plan. That, Callan theorizes, is because we've got new information or actors that are constantly challenging that agreement. Is that the right solution? Is this the right approach? Is there even a problem? So there's a constant tension between these two. And my research is interested in the intermediary, what might actually motivate cooperation or coordination, and the mechanisms that kind of control that balance, that tension. Place researchers and social capital researchers have also been very interested in collaboration, and their interests look at place in terms of the emotional connection that we might have with the landscape, place attachment. In some cases, it's been shown that attraction or an emotional connection with the landscape can motivate coordinated action. People come together about Gateway Pipeline as an example. We don't want that in BC. Sense of place is related to that sense of connection, the meanings that you derive from a particular landscape. Social capital, on the other hand, has also been shown to be important in collaboration efforts. What's the human capital that's contributing to that particular process? Do you have the key players at the table? Do you have the skills, resources, networks, resources, including funding, to actually implement the ideas that you've come up with? The Beaver Hills Initiative is a group that lends itself really well to testing these theories and looking for some of the motivators and drivers. The Beaver Hills Moraine is shown in yellow on the map on the left-hand side. It's a geomorphological feature. It's distinct on the landscape. It's raised above the surrounding agricultural landscape for the most part. It remains heavily forested. It's defied attempts to tame it with agriculture and other forms of development, but it's now looking like a very attractive landscape for rural residential development, and that's putting some pressure on that landscape, and that triggered action or promotion of an innovative idea of regional collaboration. Initially, it started with Elk Island National Park and Strathcona County. Eventually, all of the various municipalities who have lands and jurisdictions overlapping with that moraine became involved. So Beaver County, Lamont, Camrose, and Leduc. Provincial protected areas also overlap this morainal landscape. NGOs hold conservation easements and are also holding conservation properties within this landscape. And so there are quite a number of players, all of whom had an interest in protecting this particular landscape. What started with Strathcona County and Elk Island inviting their neighbors to talk about this has now become an established group that's been collaborating together for about 10 years with 30 some odd partners. It fluctuates, and it's been growing, continuing to grow over that 10-year period. There are representatives from 3 levels of government, the various municipalities that are involved in that landscape, several provincial and federal departments, including the parks and protected areas managers from that landscape as well. There are research interests in this area. The University of Alberta was one of the first groups to come forward. Both the North and the Augustana campus are now involved in the Beaver Hills Initiative. Alberta Innovates, formerly the Alberta Research Council, and the Mistakis Institute at University of Calgary are now participating in projects in this landscape. A large number of NGOs, I've just listed a few here, but there are over 10 different groups now involved in the BHI. And industry has been involved peripherally because the industrial heartland lies just outside of the moraine, but they've also had interests in this initiative at different times. So what I was interested in is how do you move from 2 interested parties, 2 proponents, to a group of 30 that have actually been able to implement and achieve some agreement on this landscape. So if you like, the first agreement was actually forming the Beaver Hills Initiative. The second was coming up with a series of principles by which you would manage for sustainable development on that landscape. And lastly, coming up with guidelines. What does sustainable development look like on this particular landscape? Each of those involved sign-off or agreement by the various partners that were involved, but principally the municipal government agencies. And this took place over a 4-year period, which is pretty remarkable when you consider other collaborative efforts. In terms of methodologies, I've used policy context review. This started out in 2002, which compared to today is a very different context for policy, particularly around conservation and sustainable development literature as well. Background documents to set up a timeline for development of the BHI, and primarily relying on interviews with 17 participants representing the 3 main sectors involved in the BHI, 3 levels of government, academic interests and research interests, and NGOs as well. Some of the participants, they ranged from politicians to land use planners to government scientists, outreach folks that are working in government agencies, so quite a broad representative group. Open-ended interviews, people were extremely generous with their time and offered up 2 hours of extended discussion about the BHI and some of the issues related to its development. And I also asked people to do a photo elicitation exercise where they would take pictures of things that they thought were representative of their moraine to get an idea of place meanings that these folks would have. Analysis, this was a qualitative study. looking at coding and constant comparative analysis methods to build a case study. The first thing that people identified as a challenge in going through these 3 different phases of development were the barriers that they were facing. Some of them are pretty obvious or common, I guess. Jurisdictional issues. There were some things that they just couldn't address. Ironically, oil and gas development was one of the things that triggered formation of the BHI. It was something that jurisdictionally was very difficult to tackle, and so they turned their attention more to rural development and rural residential development on this landscape. Perceptual issues, trying to imagine cumulative effects on a big landscape like this, was really a technical challenge as well. Coming up with mapping products really helped people get their head around what this landscape looked like and what future impacts might involve. Over that 4-year period that we're considering here, we were dealing with a number of different changes. At least one municipal election, so politically the situation changed quite a bit. Personnel would change and leave, and every time there'd be some flux on that committee because this is a voluntary commitment. It's not a top-down driven process. Those people would leave with gained information, and new people would come in unfamiliar with the process and previous decisions. The BHI was also dependent on volunteer time. Representatives were being sent by participating agencies. They were fitting this in amongst all the other things that they were doing for their day jobs. And so trying to accomplish things took a long time, and that slow progress became a bit of a barrier. I think the biggest one, the most common issue that people mentioned though, and this was consistent throughout each of those 3 phases, was the amount of trust, or distrust, I guess, initially, and through that whole process. Personalities always play a role, so there might be someone that you just don't like working with. That's pretty common for a lot of these sorts of initiatives. But there are also distrust of different members. These are all agencies and groups and individuals that had worked with each other at different times, and they may not, there might have been some suspicion about agendas and motivations. What are you really doing here? And that applied not to just only to individuals, but also organizations, and particularly between NGOs and governments, as an example. Distrust of innovation is a pretty common fear. We don't like change. We don't know where it's going to go. There's some uncertainty related to it. There's a different awareness of the level of risk as well. Development pressure was coming out from the city of Edmonton, so the people that are in direct line of impact obviously had a really good awareness of what the risk of loss, of development impact on that marina landscape would be. Others that were further out really didn't see the need initially and needed a lot more convincing. And then structurally, all of these agencies had differences in their capacity, in their ability to deal with the sorts of initiatives that the BHI was proposing. So the core group, we'll call them the proponents, came up with a variety of strategies, and they were applied at different levels. At the first level, they had to convince all the other representatives that were coming to the BHI. At the second level, those individuals, the representatives on the BHI, needed to go out and try to convince their home agencies that this was a good initiative, something that they should support. And in some cases, organizations would talk to each other as well and try to convince them to participate and collaborate. There are different factors involved in facilitating that cooperation. Trust, obviously I've covered that one off fairly well, I think. People's attitudes towards sustainable development, or development in general, was a big barrier, and the strategic approach to promoting BHI ideas really dependent if you were talking to someone who was supportive of sustainable development or leaning more towards the development side. And lastly, internal political support. Some of the organizations that were involved had a real inherent distrust, and trying to overcome that political barrier required a different set of tools and approaches. So just as an example, within the BHI, so talking to the various representatives, a lot of persuasion efforts, trying to establish what this place is, what the moraine looks like, sort of an identity of the moraine through place building. And social learning was used very effectively, I think, to bring an awareness up, or a common level of understanding about the ecology of the moraine and what it would actually take to sustain that particular landscape if people considered that important. Lots of emphasis on the benefits of collaboration as well. Everybody's challenged with financial resources, time. Banding together made an awful lot of sense, particularly where there are similar interests. Key actors played a really important role, not just the proponents, but other representatives within the BHI itself. As they became more and more convinced that this was a good idea, they would go out and either use their credibility, use their position, so talking peer-to-peer as an example. Politician-to-politician discussions were really, I think, important in convincing people to join the BHI and actually participate in different activities. Individuals would next go out and try to talk to their representative organizations and convince them that this is a good idea. Collaborating is a good idea. Managing on a sustainable basis is a good idea. In some instances where the mandates aligned, so for example, going out and talking to an NGO was pretty easy, and it was mostly just reinforcing that we're doing good things. For people that had to go back and talk to a municipality, for example, that wasn't really open to these new ideas, that was a lot more challenging. In their case, they had to be very strategic in using persuasive efforts. And they did try them, but they had to do that at a safe time. In some cases, they had to be a lot more subversive, in most cases, actually. They agreed and supported the ideas of the BHI. The BHI was generating information about the resources that they're trying to manage on their own landscapes, and so they would often use BHI data, but take the label off. So giving no credit to the Beaver Hills Initiative because it wasn't politically acceptable to bring that up. A lot of unofficial work time as well. The sanctioned time that was allotted in some of these areas was very small per month, and people were doing a lot of work after hours or undeclared to try and help further the agenda. Between organizations, so this is an actor going out and talking to another organization. Again, that's using credibility and the same sorts of techniques, peer-to-peer communication, political maneuver, where you knew there was an opportunity to go and put the BHI forward in a good light. The use of expert opinion was kind of interesting, and the academics that were involved were an obvious target for that. They come in with objective information and positions. But me, as a consultant, was apparently used as well to present that objective viewpoint and try to get a point across or persuade folks to participate. So in terms of my theoretical framework, social capital is definitely being used, or was used, in these three initial phases of the BHI. Some strategies to build trust, to bring resources to the group, to expand the network that was available to the group as well, and definitely to manage the political situation that the BHI was facing. Key actors played a really significant role. But what about place? Placemaking I've kind of covered, and that was a really concerted, determined, consistent message going forth. In almost every presentation during the initial stages of the BHI, the emphasis was on the uniqueness of this ecosystem and its proximity to an urban area. The quality of life offered by a natural area that close to an urban center, especially a fast-growing urban center, and the sense of place that's related to that. This is a place where you can retreat for reflection and rejuvenation. With that came an obligation, though. This isn't something just for us to use exclusively. That's something that we should pass on to our kids. It's an opportunity for a generational legacy. What are you leaving behind you? Personally, most of the members that I talked to had really adopted that shared message. That's what's important about working on the BHI. That's what's important about pushing the sustainable development agenda forward, is what the moraine is. And often there was a sort of a affiliation between the moraine and the BHI, so mixing up of terms, just like I almost did there. People would also have their own individual place meanings, and they weren't necessarily the same. So it was very interesting that you could have this duality of place definition and still have the same consistent motivation. It means different things to me, doesn't matter. I'm still interested in pushing forward with a common agenda and cooperating. The demonstration landscape idea was a really interesting one. It was a subset of people that had this reflection. And I have a quote from a participant that really sums it up a lot better than I could. Why am I professionally interested in participating in the BHI, and why I'm so fascinated? Because it's, out of all the tasks I might have in my job, my responsibility, that's the one I see leading to light. That's the project that's going to have results, meaningful results that fit with my dream, what I want to see, the kind of impact I want to have in my job, and in most avenues, I've got no hope of doing that. Get involved, invest in the BHI, it's going there. So suddenly, this place, this unique ecosystem, has a greater symbolic value. It's a place that inspires hope in professionals that are maybe not finding very much hope in their other activities. So in terms of the ANT process and where place and social capital might fit in, jokingly called Translation 2.2 or 2.0, place definitely seems to be playing a role as an intermediary. The environment, this context, has a unifying motivation effect. It's brought the group together to decide to do something, but it's really the social capital strategies, the strategies used to attract social capital, develop it, nurture it, that have made this thing really go and get into the planning stage. Once they got to the planning, or to the moment of agreement though, forming the BHI, for example, wasn't the end-all be-all. There were a lot of trials and tribulations in getting to that next stage of coming up with the land management principles and getting to the guidelines as well. Repetition is really key in this process. The Beaver Hills Initiative right now is recognized as a regional player, someone that exemplifies how you can do collaborative land management that has a sustainable agenda to it. That didn't happen overnight. It happened through repeated successes and demonstrations of how you could actually achieve this on this particular landscape. I think the most interesting thing, the most practical thing maybe is the outcomes of going through this process. It's fun for me, I have something theoretical to write about, but on a practical standpoint, the BHI has been able to develop this expansive network. It's recently submitted a nomination to become a biosphere reserve, which recognizes their collaboration efforts, but it also gives them access to a global network of people that are doing similar things. And that's just one example of how they've been able to expand their sphere of interest. They've become a regional leader. They're recognized as such within the Moraine, but also outside of it. The province, for example, has looked to them as an example of how to collaborate for the development of the land use framework. And lastly, there are quite a few examples of people applying these skills beyond this landscape. Taking collaboration skills, for example, and applying it within their home agencies and home organizations. So in turn, that brings up some other research ideas, but I think that's probably the most practical benefit that's coming out of the Beaver Hills, is that it's self-replicating and being applied outside of this particular initiative. So I'll end it there with a thank you to the Beaver Hills Initiative folks and your interest as well, and turn it over to Marcia.